Hello everyone. If you're interested in literature and mythology, I suppose most of you have heard some bits and bobs of Norse mythology. Probably you've heard of gods like Odin, Loki and Thor, you've heard of Asgard or Ragnarök, or other stories that are inspired by the Norse mythology. Probably you also know stories by Tolkien or the Marvel Universe, or the stories that Neil Gaiman told in works like American Gods or Norse Mythology. But where does all of this come from? If you ever wondered about that, you've come to the right place, as today I want to give you an overview of the Edda, one of the most profound literary sources we have on Norse mythology from the medieval ages. So if you're ready, stay tuned and let's get started. Let us start talking about what the Edda is not, because there are a few misconceptions revolving this term. So, first, the Edda refers to two medieval Icelandic literary works that are our primary source for Norse mythology, as I said before. It is not a single book, but rather two distinct texts that are themselves made up of several texts and stories. One is called the Prose Edda and one is called the Poetic Edda. Common misconceptions are surrounding the idea that it is a text of Viking wisdom or Viking sayings, which is wrong, especially because it was composed much later than the Viking Age. And it is also not a complete record of all Norse myths. And it is also not a religious text used by Norse pagans, as is sometimes wrongly believed. And this is true especially because both works have been written in the 13th century, when Iceland was already fully Christianized. Therefore you find many Christian influences in both works. And why are the books called Edda? This is quite complicated. So the origin of the name Edda is highly debated and there's different theories. Some suggest that the term Edda means something like great-grandmother, which would imply some kind of ancient wisdom, and this is also appearing in one of the poems in the Poetic Edda, but it would not really make any sense to call this book great-grandmother, so it's quite confusing. Another possibility would be that it could derive from the word odr, which means poetry or art of poetry. It could also come from the word odi, which is the court in Iceland where Snorri Sturluson was educated, and he's the author of the Prose Edda. But one of the options that is supposed to be most plausible by many scholars is that it is related to the Latin word, the verb edo, meaning I compose, and this is believed to be the most plausible version. And Edda is also the title that Snorri Sturluson gives his book. He says this book is called Edda. So there's the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, but it is also important to note that neither the Poetic Edda is completely made up of poetry, nor is the Prose Edda made up completely of prose. Both also contain elements from prose and poetry. So this is also highly confusing. Another misconception is that the Poetic Edda is often called the Older Edda, while the Prose Edda is called the Younger Edda, which is also wrong if you're looking at the dates when the works were composed or finished. The work, the Prose Edda, was finished by Snorri Sturluson in 1225, whilst the Poetic Edda, which consists of different mythological songs, was only written down in 1270 or even later. So this is all quite mixed up and quite difficult to understand. And there's quite profound differences between the Prose and the Poetic Edda. Both consist of heroic and mythological stories, and sometimes also tell the same stories, but they are made up in different forms. And while we have a specific known author for the Prose Edda, Snorri Sturluson, we don't have the same for the Poetic Edda, which probably goes back a lot earlier and was written down only in a later point of time. But the manuscript was also probably transferred from another manuscript, so it was copied several times. Therefore, it is especially difficult to say how old the stories of the Poetic Edda are and when they were written down for the first time. So this just to know as a background information. Let us then start with looking at the Poetic Edda and later look at the Prose Edda, and for both of which I am looking a little bit closer at one of the texts, so you get an idea of what the stories are about. So let us start with the Poetic Edda. As I said, it's probably been written down around 1270, and the most famous and comprehensive manuscript we have is the Codex Regius, whose first ownership was dated in 1643. There's other manuscript versions of the Poetic Edda, but I won't go into detail into that. So the Poetic Edda is divided in two parts. One of them is mythological poems about the gods and the creation and destruction of the world. And the second is heroic poems about legendary heroes and their exploits. So there are in both versions many figures appear that you probably heard of, such as Odin, Loki, Thor, and the creation myth. And also in the heroic poems, figures, for example, from the Nibelungenlied appear, such as Sigurd and Brunhild and others. I will go into detail more on that in the future in other videos, so stay tuned for that, please. But what we want to talk about today is the creation myth, or the myth of the creation and destruction of the whole world, which is told in the Völuspá, which is the prophecy of the seeress, which is one of the most famous poems in the Poetic Edda, and it's also standing at the very beginning. So this also states how relevant it is for the whole work. It presents the creation of the world, the history of the gods, the prophecy of Ragnarök, which is the end of the world, and the rebirth of a new world. So in this poem, the so-called Völva, who is a seeress, is asked by the god Odin to tell the myth of the creation of the world and the gods and the whole story. And it can be divided into a few main sections. The first one is the creation. The Völva describes the primordial void of Ginnungagap, the emergence of the first being, Ymir, and how the gods shaped the world from his corpse. So they took parts of his body and shaped different parts of the world from it. And this also includes the establishing the 9 realms connected by Yggdrasil, which is the world tree. Then the Völva tells about the golden age and the decline. The poem recounts an early period of harmony among the gods before detailing their moral failings, particularly Odin's deception in obtaining the meed of poetry and the gods' collective murder of the wise being Mimir. I won't go into more detail right now because it would be a little bit too long, and I will talk in more detail about the Völuspá in a future video. Then there's the Ragnarök, the apocalyptic battle where gods and monsters mutually destroy each other, and this is very, very vividly portrayed and also making up a big part of the Völuspá. The poem then concludes with a vision of a renewal, a new earth emerging from the sea where surviving gods and 2 human survivors will repopulate the world. Scholars have debated a lot about this work, its meaning and its religious and mythological influences, and it is very lively and quick to read as well, so I can definitely recommend reading it if you're interested in just getting a glimpse of the Poetic Edda. And this is just one of the stories that the Poetic Edda is made up of. There's a lot more, as I said, especially on the gods and the heroes, and if you're interested in learning more in more detail, or if you have questions about specific myths, please let me know and I would be happy to make a video on that too. But next up we want to talk about the Prose Edda. So the Prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson and finished in 1225, reorganizes the material, the mythological stories, into a coherent guide. Snorri was an Icelandic chieftain and scholar, and he wrote during a period when traditional Norse culture was being supplanted by Christian European influences more and more. And his work serves both as a mythological handbook and a defense of traditional skaldic poetry. So the skalds were the poets of the north of Iceland, and the Prose Edda is a handbook that teaches them to write well and at the same time tells the most famous stories of Norse mythology. The Prose Edda consists of 4 different sections. First, there's a prologue, an account presenting the Norse gods as ancient human warriors who come from Troy, which was quite popular at that time. Then there's the Gylfaginning, the tricking of Gylfi, which is the core mythological narrative, which also tells a creation myth. The third one is the Skaldskapama, which is the poetic diction or the art of poetry, a guide to skaldic poetry's complex metaphors. And the last one is the Hatatal, the list of meters, a technical discussion of verse forms. I want to talk a little bit more about the Gylfaginning, which is like this core mythological narrative, the delusion or tricking of King Gylfi. It employs a sophisticated framing device where King Gylfi of Sweden is disguised as a man called Gangleri and visits the gods' stronghold of Asgard. Asgard is where the gods live. There he questions 3 enthroned figures called High, Just as High, and Third, who are later revealed to be Odin in different forms. In the dialogue, Gylfi learns about the creation of the world and the cosmology, and also about the gods and their doings, and also about Ragnarök. So first, he learns that the gods slay the primeval giant Ymir, fashioned the world from his body. For example, from his flesh they made the earth, from the blood they made the seas, from the bones they made the mountains, from the skull they made the sky, and from his brain they made the clouds, which is my favorite part. Then he learns about the cosmology, the detailed description of the tree Yggdrasil and the 9 realms, including Asgard, the home of the gods, Midgard, the human world, Jotunheim, the land of the giants, and Hel, the underworld. Then he learns about gods and their doings, and there's extended narratives about Odin's sacrifice of his eye to the wise being Mimir for gaining wisdom, Thor's fishing trip where he nearly catches Jörmungandr, who is the Midgard serpent, and the death of Balder and Loki's punishment. I cannot talk too much about all of the stories in detail because this video would be very long, but I can make videos about each of the stories if you're interested. Then Gylfi also learns about Ragnarök. An expanded version of the apocalyptic battle is told here, which specifies each god's fate. Odin is devoured by the wolf Fenrir. Thor kills the Midgard serpent but dies from its venom. and Sutra's flames consume the whole world. And the narrative concludes with Gylfi's disillusionment. The glorious hall and gods vanish, leaving him alone on a plain. Scholars interpret this as Snorri's way of acknowledging pagan beliefs as illusions while preserving them as cultural heritage. But it can also be interpreted in other ways, of course. I found this text to be quite interesting because it's quite easy to get into, and you also learn a lot about this creation and cosmology and about Ragnarök, and also comparing the Völuspá with the Gylfaginning is quite interesting. And it's quite a different experience because you have many components that are the same, but they are told in a completely different way, also because one is told more in the prose form, one in the poetic form. And the style of the prose and the Poetic Edda in general are quite different. While the Poetic Edda also preserves variant traditions, the Prose Edda harmonizes them into a widely single narrative, and the Poetic Edda seems more commemorative, while the Prose Edda aims to instruct poets and preserve tradition in another way. And I think what is quite interesting to see as well is that Snorri's Christian influences are shining through a lot when you're reading the Prose Edda. So you see how he shapes the material as he's influenced by the Christian belief and religion. And this is a short overview of the Prose and the Poetic Edda. So what are these works and what are they telling you? And now, lastly, let us look at the influence that the Edda, or the Eddas to be precise, had on the literary and storytelling world. One of the most important influences it had was on J.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth, which drew heavily on Eddic themes from ring curses to dragon lore, and also, for example, he took quite a few names to name the dwarfs in The Lord of the Rings. So you will be reminded of things you might be familiar with when reading the Edda, which is quite nice, I think. And also, of course, in popular culture, Marvel's adaptations of Thor and Loki, and other games like God of War or Baldur's Gate reinterpret Norse mythology and material that you can find in the Edda. There's lots more, of course, but this is just what I wanted to mention because it's most striking, I think. And I hope you enjoyed this short overview of what the Edda is, and I will go into more detail in the future and compare different stories, also with the Nibelungenlied and also with Beowulf, because there's quite interesting influences and parallels between the works, so that will be quite fascinating to see, I think. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you were interested in learning about more details or about specific stories, please let me know. I will be happy to make a video about any text or any question you might have, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for sticking till the end if you did, and thank you for watching. If you haven't yet, please consider subscribing to the channel, and I will hopefully see you in my next video. Thank you and bye bye!